Unlocking Pandora's Box. Session 1: The Ethical Precipice. In the heart of a bustling cityscape, my office stood as a sanctuary of solace and introspection. I am Dr. Elias Warner, a figure of respect and authority in the psychiatric community, yet it is in the seclusion of my private laboratory where my true vocation lies, unraveling the enigmas of the human mind. My journey into the realm of moral psychology began with a philosophical debate with Dr. Nathan Cole, a discourse that kindled a burning desire within me. This desire, to understand, and perhaps alter, the moral compass of a human being. This quest birthed Compound 9, a serum with the potential to redefine our understanding of good and evil. The quest for a subject to test Compound 9 was exhaustive and painstaking. My office, usually a stage for routine psychiatric sessions, transformed into a crucible for my search. Among the many who sought refuge and counsel within these walls, Mrs. Richardson emerged as a person of exceptional interest. Mrs. Richardson's plight was not just another story of personal anguish, it was a narrative that resonated with profound moral implications. Her world had been upended by a dual betrayal, her husband's infidelity with her sister. It was a wound that cut deep, not just emotionally, but ethically as well. Yet, in her, I saw not a spirit bent on retribution, but one anchored in a deep-seated sense of morality. She had come to me on the recommendation of the deacon of her church, a testament to the faith she placed in her religious convictions to guide her through these tumultuous times. Our sessions often delved into her struggle to navigate past the hurt and betrayal, her voice resonating with a blend of sorrow and unwavering moral clarity. She spoke of forgiveness, of empathy, of understanding, qualities that seemed to define her very essence. In Mrs. Richardson, I saw the epitome of moral virtue, making her the ideal candidate for my experiment with Compound 9. This decision to use her as a test subject marked a collision between my scientific curiosity and the ethical duty I held as her psychiatrist. The day I made the choice to cross this boundary, my hands trembled with trepidation. Preparing her tea during our session, the vial of Compound 9 in my pocket felt like a harbinger of the ethical storm I was about to unleash. I was about to venture into uncharted ethical territory. As she sipped her tea, unaware of the seismic shift that was about to transpire within her, I set in motion a chain of events that would not only test the limits of human morality but also question the very foundations of my ethical principles. The clock in my office ticked on, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Each second that passed marked not only the passage of time but also the beginning of an exploration that would challenge the core of human ethics and the depths of my conscience. Session 2: Unraveling Convictions. The atmosphere in my office had subtly shifted as Mrs. Richardson settled into her usual seat. I could sense the early tendrils of Compound 9's influence weaving through her psyche. As I handed her the tea, laced with the next dose of the compound, I prepared myself to delve deeper into her evolving mental landscape. "How have you been processing your feelings about your husband and sister since our last session?" I inquired, adopting the familiar tone of a concerned therapist, while internally, I was the keen observer, anticipating the effects of the compound. She took a sip of her tea, her brow furrowing in thought. "I've been struggling, Dr. Warner. There's this anger inside me. I've always believed in forgiveness, in turning the other cheek, but now..." Her voice trailed off, laden with conflict. I leaned forward, my interest piqued. "But now?" I prompted gently. She sighed, a deep, exasperated breath. "Now, I don't feel like forgiving them. It's like there's this voice inside me saying they don't deserve my forgiveness. And the strangest part is, I'm starting to agree with it." Her admission was a clear departure from her earlier sessions, where she grappled with her pain but remained steadfast in her moral convictions. "That's quite a shift in your perspective, Mrs. Richardson. Do you have any idea why you might be feeling this way?" She shook her head, a look of confusion crossing her features. "I don't know, and it's frightening. It's not the Christian way, it's not who I am. Or at least, who I thought I was." Her hands clutched the teacup, a visible manifestation of her inner turmoil. I observed her, my mind analyzing each word, each gesture. It's not uncommon to experience a range of emotions in your situation. Anger, even thoughts of revenge, can be a part of the healing process, I said, steering the conversation to explore the depths of her shifting emotions. But this isn't just passing anger, Dr. Warner. It's more consuming, more real. I find myself thinking about ways to make them suffer, to make them feel the pain they've caused me. And these thoughts, they don't scare me, they feel justified. Her voice carried a new edge, a stark contrast to her previous tone of despair and helplessness. This was a crucial revelation. Compound 9 was working, unraveling the fabric of her moral being, guiding her towards a path of retribution and malice. And how do you feel about these new thoughts, these desires for revenge? I probed, eager to document the psychological transformation unfolding before me. I'm conflicted, she admitted. Part of me knows it's wrong, that I should be seeking peace and forgiveness. But another part of me feels empowered by these thoughts. It's like I'm waking up from a long slumber, seeing the world, and my place in it, in a new light. The session continued, with Mrs. Richardson articulating her internal battle between her ingrained beliefs and the burgeoning feelings of vengeance. With each word, I could see the moral boundaries being redrawn, her psyche adapting to the new, darker narrative being scripted by the serum. As she left my office that day, I sat back, a mix of satisfaction and apprehension washing over me. The experiment was progressing beyond my expectations. Mrs. Richardson, once a paragon of forgiveness and humility, was now a canvas for the darker emotions I had unleashed. I pondered the ethical implications of my actions but found myself more captivated by the scientific revelations unfolding. The clock in my office ticked on, a metronome to the moral and psychological odyssey that I had initiated. Session 3: The Deepening Darkness. The change in Mrs. Richardson was more pronounced when she arrived for her next session. Gone was the meek, despondent woman who first walked into my office. In her place was someone almost unrecognizable, confident, assertive, and emanating a sense of defiance that was entirely new. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Richardson," I greeted her, noticing immediately the transformation in her attire. She wore tight jeans and a comfortable shirt, a stark contrast to her previously conservative wardrobe. Her makeup, applied with a subtle yet noticeable flair, highlighted her features. But what caught my attention most were her eyes, the once soft green now a deep, mysterious brown. "Dr. Warner," she replied, her voice carrying a newfound boldness as she took her seat. She didn't hang her head in her usual shy manner but instead met my gaze directly, almost challengingly. As we delved into the session, her narrative took a darker turn. "I've left the church," she announced, a hint of bitterness in her tone. "They keep preaching forgiveness and moving on. But I'm done with that. I'm done being the one who always has to bend and break." Her words, laced with resentment, were a testament to the profound shift in her moral compass. It was further punctuated when she let slip a few curse words, which took me aback. In all our sessions, I had never heard her swear. It was a jarring departure from her usual demeanor. I noted this change carefully, my scientific curiosity piqued even as I maintained my professional facade. She then recounted her recent family gathering, her voice tinged with venom. "Yesterday, I found out my parents knew about the affair. They actually justified it, said my sister was better than me because she could have kids, unlike me." Her fists clenched in anger. "I lost it. I slapped her and threw my husband out of my house, and you know what? I don't regret it. Not one bit." This revelation was astounding. Mrs. Richardson, who had once epitomized forgiveness and humility, was now embracing anger and defiance. Her transformation was more profound than I had anticipated. "I'm feeling better about myself now," she admitted, a sense of pride in her voice. "I'm no longer that doormat, the one who just takes whatever life throws at her." "That's a significant decision, Mrs. Richardson. How do you feel about this change in your stance?" She leaned back, a smirk playing on her lips. "I feel liberated, Dr. Warner. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm in control of my life. And it feels damn good." She pauses for a moment, looking out the window. You know, sometimes I wonder what would happen if they just disappeared one day, she mused, her tone casual but the underlying implication chilling. As she spoke, I could barely contain my fascination. The experiment had taken a turn I hadn't fully anticipated. Here, before me, was a living, breathing testament to the power of Compound 9 to alter the very essence of a person's being. As the session concluded, I was left with a mix of awe and apprehension, not sure what to expect next. The clock in my office ticked on, a reminder of the relentless march of time and the irreversible nature of the changes unfolding before me. Session 4: The Unfolding Enigma. As I waited in my office, my eyes drifted to the clock on the wall more often than usual. Mrs. Richardson, a paragon of punctuality, was uncharacteristically late. This deviation from her habitual timeliness was a stark indicator of the profound changes she was undergoing. When she finally arrived, escorted by my secretary, the transformation was breathtaking. Mrs. Richardson, once cloaked in modesty, now stood before me as a figure of striking allure. Her hair was styled to perfection, her nails manicured, and her makeup artfully enhancing her features. What captivated me most was her attire, a short skirt accentuating her well-defined legs, complemented by a form-fitting top that left little to the imagination. The transformation was radical, almost as if she had shed her old self and stepped into an entirely new skin. Mrs. Richardson's transformation in my office was not just a shift in appearance, it was a complete metamorphosis of her personality, attitude, and demeanor. The woman who sat before me now was a far cry from the one I had known. Her flirtatious manner and the confident sway in her posture were as captivating as they were disconcerting. As our conversation ventured into her personal life, Mrs. Richardson didn't hold back. "Last night at some bar, I met this man," she began, her voice tinged with a hint of pride. "It wasn't just a booty call, Dr. Warner, it was a revelation. A sexual marathon, you could say." Her description was graphic, detailing an encounter that was passionate, uninhibited, and wildly out of character for the conservative woman she once was. Observing her recount the experience with such relish was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It was clear that the Compound 9 had not just altered her moral compass, but had unleashed a side of her that was entirely new, or perhaps deeply buried. As she finished her tale, she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that was almost predatory. With a sinister grin, she playfully lifted her skirt slightly, revealing more of her legs. "Does that arouse you, Dr. Warner?" she asked, her voice a sultry whisper. Her boldness caught me off guard, leaving me momentarily speechless. This was uncharted territory, a blending of professional boundaries and personal reactions that I was unprepared to navigate. Regaining my composure, I steered the conversation back to the more familiar ground. "Mrs. Richardson, let's refocus on the recent developments with your family. How are you managing the fallout from your husband's and sister's betrayal, and your family's reaction?" Her response was swift and sharp, devoid of the emotional turmoil that once accompanied discussions of her family. "They're irrelevant to me now," she declared with a dismissive wave of her hand. "A bunch of losers, really. I should have cut them out of my life long ago. They're as good as dead to me." Her casual mention of death was chilling, especially considering the dramatic shift in her personality. "And when you say they're as good as dead, what exactly do you mean by that, Mrs. Richardson?" I asked, cautiously probing her mindset. She laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Oh, Dr. Warner, wouldn't it be convenient if they actually were dead? Life would be so much simpler." The fleeting darkness that overtook her eyes again made me question if I was seeing things, or if something more sinister was at play. The session with Mrs. Richardson was spiraling into uncharted territory, far beyond the bounds of any conventional therapy. Her transformation under the influence of Compound 9 had escalated to a level that was both deeply troubling and scientifically astounding. As our conversation veered into the taboo, Mrs. Richardson suddenly stood up, her movements exuding a sultry confidence that was magnetically alluring yet filled me with unease. She walked towards me with a deliberate, seductive gait, her every step a testament to the profound change she had undergone. Before I could react, she straddled me, her proximity overwhelming. Her lips found mine in a hard, demanding kiss, her body grinding against me in a manner that was both provocative and alarming. It was a moment of intense conflict. The professional boundaries I had always upheld were being shattered by the very subject of my experiment. Regaining a semblance of control, I gently but firmly pushed her back. "Mrs. Richardson, this is not right," I said, my voice a mixture of sternness and disbelief. It was then that I saw it, her eyes. They were entirely black, devoid of any white, a startling and unnatural sight. The transformation was not just psychological, it was physical, and it defied any logical explanation. Angered by my rejection, Mrs. Richardson slapped me across the face, her voice seething with venom. "You bastard!" She spat out and stormed out of the room. The violent slam of the door as she left was so forceful that it dislodged a picture from the wall, causing it to crash to the floor. I sat there, motionless, trying to process the surreal and alarming events that had just unfolded. My mind raced with questions and fears. What had I unleashed? The experiment with Compound 9, intended to explore the realms of human morality, had spiraled into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The image of Mrs. Richardson's black eyes haunted me. They were an aberration that defied scientific explanation, suggesting that the compound had triggered something beyond a mere psychological transformation. Had I, in my pursuit of understanding the human psyche, unlocked a door to something much darker and more profound? As I paced the room, my mind raced with the possible biochemical pathways and mutations that Compound 9 might have initiated. The thought that I had altered something fundamental in human biology was both a scientist's dream and a nightmare. The office, once an intellectual pursuit, now felt like the epicenter of an ethical catastrophe. The silence in the aftermath of Mrs. Richardson's departure was deafening, punctuated only by the steady ticking of the clock. Session 5, Pandora. The morning dawned with a sense of foreboding, a premonition that something was amiss. As I drove to work, the chatter on the radio was background noise until a news bulletin pierced through, turning my blood cold. A tragic house fire had claimed 4 lives. The names of the victims were announced, and a wave of horror washed over me. They were Mrs. Richardson's husband, sister, and parents. A chilling realization struck me. Could Mrs. Richardson be responsible? Had my experiment with Compound 9 not only altered her moral compass but also driven her to commit such a heinous act? The thought was unbearable, yet inescapable. I was potentially complicit in a horrific crime. As I entered my office and closed the door, my mind was a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and confusion. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I failed to notice the pair of shapely legs propped up on my desk. "Elias," a familiar voice called out, jolting me from my reverie. The formality of her using my first name was unsettling. I looked up, and there she was, Mrs. Richardson, sitting casually in my chair, an enigmatic smile on her lips. She wore glasses, presumably to conceal her eyes, but their presence only added to the ominous aura she now exuded. Her presence in my office was both startling and terrifying. How had she gotten in without my notice? What was she doing here after the horrific news of the fire? I stood frozen, unable to speak, as she regarded me with an unnerving calmness. "You look surprised to see me, Elias," she said, her voice laced with a sinister sultriness. "Did you think I wouldn't come back?" The reality of the situation was overwhelming. The woman before me was both a victim and a product of my scientific ambition, now potentially a perpetrator of an unimaginable crime. The guilt and responsibility I felt were suffocating. "Mrs. Richardson, the news about your family," I began, my voice trailing off, unsure how to address the elephant in the room. Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. It was a smile that sent shivers down my spine. "Ah, the fire. Tragic, isn't it? But then, tragedies happen all the time," she replied, her tone nonchalant, almost indifferent. "By the way, Elias, what have you done to me? The air in my office, once a bastion of intellectual pursuit and healing, had transformed into a palpable miasma of fear and tension with Mrs. Richardson's presence. The shift in her demeanor from seductive to threatening was as sudden as it was terrifying. Her accusation cut through the room with icy precision. My attempts to deflect fell flat, my words sounding hollow in my own ears. "I don't understand what you mean, Mrs. Richardson," I stammered, but the lie was transparent. Her laugh, devoid of any warmth, echoed mockingly. "The tea, Elias. The tea you so diligently prepared for me each session. You drugged it, didn't you?" The accusation, laced with a venomous clarity, was my own undoing. Before I could muster a response, she commanded, "Sit down." And I found myself obeying, more out of fear than respect. From my desk, she produced the bottle of Compound 9 and my meticulously kept research notes. As she read aloud my observations and hypotheses, her voice was tinged with revulsion. "You're a monster, Elias. No better than the rest, maybe even worse," she concluded. The room fell into a heavy silence, filled only by the crackling of the papers as she set them aflame with a lighter. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the burning papers into the small trash can beside my desk. I watched in horror as the flames consumed my meticulous research, years of ethical boundaries crossed and rationalizations burning away in moments. In a desperate attempt to salvage something, anything, I lunged towards the growing inferno. But Mrs. Richardson, with an unholy strength, snatched me by the throat and lifted me effortlessly. The disparity between her petite frame and the brute force she exerted was beyond comprehension. She removed her glasses, revealing the solid black voids that were her eyes, a chilling testament to the unnatural transformation she had undergone. Her grip tightened, and I felt the air being squeezed from my body. Leaning in, her voice was a twisted whisper. "I thought there was one person I could trust, Elias. I was wrong." Her smile was grotesque, a distorted semblance of joy. In a swift, brutal motion, she dug her inhuman fingernails into the back of my neck. A searing pain shot through my neck. My body crumpled to the ground, paralyzed and broken. Mrs. Richardson looked down at me with a cold detachment as she kicked over the trash can, the flames leaping to the curtains, igniting a chain reaction that set the room ablaze. She leaned down, her lips brushing my forehead in a mockingly tenderness. "Goodbye, Elias. In a way, I did like you," she said, her voice a haunting lullaby in the midst of the inferno. She walked out of my office with a calmness that belied the chaos around her, leaving me lying broken on the floor. As the flames enveloped the room and smoke filled my lungs, my final thoughts were consumed by the gravity of what I had unleashed. In my quest to understand the nature of good and evil, I had opened Pandora's box, unleashing something far beyond the confines of morality and science. The realization that my pursuit of knowledge had led to this tragic end was a bitter epiphany. As the fire raged around me, claiming everything in its path, I understood the true cost of my hubris. The clock, once a constant reminder of the passage of time, was now silent, just like the heartbeat of a man who dared too much, delving into realms best left unexplored. The end.